Hey heroes, welcome to another interdimensional episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Previously on the channel, we talked about the origins and death of Madelyne Pryor, the Goblin Queen. To briefly recap, the mad geneticist Mr. Sinister sought to breed a mutant capable of defeating his former master, Apocalypse, by combining the DNA of the X-Men Jean Grey and Scott Summers, aka Cyclops. Madelyne Pryor was a clone of Jean created by Sinister that initially lacked consciousness, but awakened when it received a fraction of the real Jean's life force that had been taken and used by the Cosmic Phoenix Force. With the real Jean thought to be dead in the wake of the Dark Phoenix incident, Sinister programmed Madelyne to fall in love with Scott, positioning things so that the two would marry and sire the child that he wanted. Initially, things went according to plan with the birth of their son Nathan, but of course, this being an X-Men story, the whole situation soon got pretty complicated. Between the return of Jean Grey and the influence of demons from the hellish Limbo dimension, Madelyne Pryor fell to madness and became the villainous Goblin Queen. She attempted to facilitate a demonic invasion of Earth, an event that has been dubbed the Inferno, but was thwarted by the X-Men and ultimately perished in a vain attempt to destroy the heroes. That wasn't truly the end of Madelyne Pryor, however. During her final battle with the X-Men and X-Factor, Madelyne confronted Jean and their minds were linked together. In order to survive the experience, Jean was forced to take back the piece of herself that resided within Madelyne, the same piece that had been previously wielded and corrupted by the Phoenix Force. But because that Phoenix fragment is what initially sparked Madelyne's consciousness, the two had become intertwined. As a result, a piece of Madelyne survived within Jean and subtly affected her actions over the following months. Now, that situation came to a head while X-Factor were caught up in a conflict involving the Celestials on an alien planet. While there, Madelyne's personality succeeded in taking control of Jean and attempted to reclaim her son, Nathan. In the end, Jean regained control of herself and expelled the remnants of the Phoenix Force in her body, using it to help drive back the Celestial Judge, Erisham, and postpone his verdict on the planet's denizens. Obviously, there's more to that story, but the important thing for today is that in doing so, she also rid herself of Madelyne's lingering consciousness. I will also note that, as for Nathan, he was later infected with a Techno-Organic Virus and brought to the far future, where he grew up to become the time-traveling freedom fighter Cable, but that's a story for another day. But for the rest of this week's story, we need to look to everyone's favorite comic book trope, alternate universes. One we've talked about before is Earth 295, better known as the Age of Apocalypse, a divergent timeline in which Charles Xavier was killed before founding the X-Men, and thus Apocalypse was able to accelerate his plans for global conquest, successfully taking over the world. In this reality, things went very differently as Mr. Sinister adopted Scott Summers and his brother Alex. Instead of cloning Jean as part of a complicated plot, this Sinister was able to artificially combine Scott and Jean's DNA, secretly creating their genetic offspring, who he named Nathan Grey. Raised in captivity while being artificially aged to adolescence, Nate Grey was eventually freed by Cyclops, although neither one was aware of their blood connection. He subsequently took the name X-Man, but his story is another we could talk about in more detail another time. One thing I've mentioned in other videos is that the Age of Apocalypse originally came from a misguided attempt to alter the past, and so for a time, it actually supplanted the prime reality Earth 616. The true timeline was eventually restored, and several individuals from the Age of Apocalypse were transported to the prime reality, one of which was Nate Grey. Now, before we come back to him, we need to talk about Earth 998, whose timeline is very different from the ones mentioned above. In that universe, Madelyne Pryor was a queen who ruled over a worldwide British Empire in the 19th century. She eventually passed away from old age and illness in the late 1800s, and on her deathbed she decreed that her body would be burned so that she would rise again from the ashes. When she failed to return, however, the Empire began to fracture as multiple territories broke free, leading to war and political upheaval across the planet. Now, we'll come back to that world in a moment, but first we have to mention Earth 9575, a reality in which Jean Grey was not a hero, but a violent, power-hungry despot. That alternate Jean was ultimately defeated by heroes who succeeded in decimating her power and banishing her from their reality. She emerged on Earth 998, the war-torn world of the deceased Queen Madelyne I. Nearly identical, the alternate Jean Grey claimed to be a resurrected Madelyne and united half the planet under her rule, becoming known as the Red Queen. She sought a way to subjugate the rival Asian Empire and soon found what she believed to be the ultimate weapon in the form of that world's Nate Grey. Well, I say that world's, technically the Nate Grey on Earth 998 originally came from the divergent Earth 2098, similar to how the one on Prime Earth was created in the Age of Apocalypse. Anyway, the Red Queen decided that while powerful, that particular X-Man was far too unstable to be used, and attempted to kill him. Thinking herself successful, she sought a replacement and tasked that reality's equivalent of the mutant inventor Forge with creating a machine to peer across the multiverse, the Interscope. He also devised a method of sending individuals to other universes, but was unable to retrieve them. That was enough, however, for the Red Queen to search various realities for alternate Nate Greys and lure them to Earth 998. Over the following 8 years, she collected numerous Nathans, one after the other, neutralizing any genetic failsafes left behind by their respective Sinisters, but invariably deemed each one defective before killing him and moving on to the next. Now this is where the threads of this story start coming together, as the Red Queen of Earth 998 took notice of X-Man's emergence in the Swiss Alps of Earth 616. Taking advantage of his loneliness in an unfamiliar world, the Red Queen psionically manipulated Nate into seizing the psychic residue that was left behind when Jean ejected the remnants of Madelyne Pryor's consciousness, reconstituting it into a new body. Her memories foggy and incomplete, the resurrected Madelyne soon met Nate, and the two quickly formed a close bond. Suffice it to say, between the amnesia and alternate realities, neither realized that they were essentially the genetic equivalent of mother and son. Regardless, Madelyne was soon noticed by the immortal mutant Selene Gallio, who lured her away for her own purposes. Seeking to secure her position in the notorious Hellfire Club, Selene brought Madelyne to the Black King, Sebastian Shaw. After proving herself in combat against the Red Rook, Scribe, and separating Scribe from the body-stealing mutant Mountjoy, Madelyne was inducted into the club's newly restored inner circle as the Black Rook. After that, Shaw's aide, Tessa, today better known as Sage, sought to learn more about the mysterious Madelyne by probing her mind. This led to a confrontation between the two on the psionic plane that reawakened Madelyne's repressed memories. Freed from Selene's influence, Madelyne searched for Nate and killed another woman that he'd become romantically involved with, Threnody. Interesting to note about that encounter is that Threnody was a mutant with the power to absorb necroplasmic energy from the dying, and her senses indicated that Madelyne was still technically dead. In any event, Madelyne and Nate reunited at the cabin in the Swiss Alps where they first met, and she pulled him in for a passionate kiss. Fortunately, their quasi-incestuous makeout session was interrupted by Jean Grey, that's the heroic Jean Grey of Earth 616, who sensed Madelyne's return. Nate was understandably confused by the whole situation, but tried to stop Madelyne when she attacked Jean. In the end, he realized that the resurrected Madelyne was essentially a psionic construct brought to life by his powers, and tried to make things right by reabsorbing her. However, Madelyne broke free and escaped, proving herself to be more than just an extension of Nate. She returned to the Hellfire Club and seduced Sebastian Shaw to solidify her position within the inner circle. She also had Shaw officially announce to the rest of the club that she was his consort, much to the annoyance of Selene and Tessa. Madelyne subsequently confronted her actual son Cable on the astral plane and revealed the details of their origins to him. She tried to convince him to join her, claiming that the X-Men were the evil ones, but Cable refused. He proclaimed that the real evil was Apocalypse, who Cable had sworn to defeat. And he may have actually gotten through to her, for later when Shaw plotted to harness Apocalypse's power for himself, Madelyne secretly met with Cable again and gave him the information he needed to stop him. But in the background of all of this, and as time went on, the Red Queen of Earth 998 was slowly gaining more and more control as she continued to transfer herself into Madelyne's body. Madelyne reunited with Nate Gray at a point where he felt utterly alone and tried to seduce him into continuing their illicit relationship. He initially rebuffed her advances, but she continued to follow him using a newly unlocked teleportation ability, offering help and support wherever she could. She aided him against foes like the other-dimensional Great Beasts, Nemesis, aka Holocaust, the son of Apocalypse from the same timeline as Nate, and Strife, an evil clone of Cable from the far future. Meanwhile, the Red Queen was infiltrating Nate's mind and implanting controls that would allow her to command him. Eventually, she was able to completely subvert Madelyne's consciousness, inhabiting her body and using Nate's powers to bring them both back to Earth 998. Once there, she revealed her true intentions of using him as a weapon to defeat her enemies and re-establish the dominance of her global empire. Resisting her control, Nate escaped by following the psychic call of his dimensional counterpart there. He came face to face with another Nate Gray, the very first one that the Red Queen had attempted to use. The Queen sent her knights, led by a man named Mr. Scratch, to retrieve her newest Nate. Both Nates were badly injured in the fight, but the older one used his powers to repair the younger one's body and mind, removing the Red Queen's psychic hooks before sending him back to Earth 616. He also swapped the differences in their physical appearances, and so Scratch brought him back to the Red Queen, thinking the other had been incinerated. Realizing what he'd done, the Red Queen angrily executed the older Nate. Meanwhile, the younger Nate, the one we've been following this whole time, finally realized his full power and returned to confront the Red Queen. In the end, Nate Gray overwhelmed and destroyed the Red Queen, putting an end to her reign once and for all. And yet this was still not the end of Madelyne Pryor, for when the Red Queen usurped her body, Madelyne's consciousness persisted as a psychic ghost in the astral plane. During one incident in which Apocalypse captured 12 specific mutants, including Cyclops and Cable, Madelyne pulled her former husband and son's consciousness into the astral plane with her in a replica of the Alaskan home that she and Scott lived in when they were together. With the world seemingly doomed, she offered to let them stay there with her so they could be a family again. Of course, Cable declined, but Madelyne released them both, returning them to their bodies so they could continue the fight against Apocalypse. In the end, the X-Men were victorious and life went on. Over the following years, the lineup and status quo of the heroic mutant team shifted and changed as they endured a number of other conflicts. Significant for today's story is that Jean Grey was eventually killed by a powerful mutant named Kuan Yin Zorn, who was impersonating Magneto at the time. In the aftermath of that, Cyclops embraced his burgeoning relationship with the former White Queen of the Hellfire Club, Emma Frost. At the same time, Madelyne's lingering consciousness was growing increasingly bitter and vengeful. No stranger to the mystic arts, due to her time as the Goblin Queen, she eventually attained magical abilities of her own and successfully manifested on Earth once again. She tracked down the former Hellion, Manuel de la Rocha, aka Empath, and seduced him into a sadomasochistic relationship. For those unfamiliar, the original Hellions were mutant students of Emma Frost during her time with the Hellfire Club. Manifesting as a leather-clad dominatrix for her bondage-filled sessions with Empath, Madelyne also claimed the name Red Queen for herself. Using his emotion-manipulating abilities, she assembled a gang of anti-mutant extremists called the Hellfire Cult to make trouble for the X-Men in San Francisco, where they had recently moved. Before long, the mutant heroes tracked the cult to their headquarters and abandoned the sex club and succeeded in capturing Empath. Although while there, Madelyne briefly impersonated Emma to take advantage of Scott. Her role in assembling the Hellfire cult initially went undetected, but shortly after their defeat, while celebrating in a crowded club, Scott caught a glimpse of her, and his heart sank with the realization that Madelyne Pryor had returned. And the cult wasn't the only scheme she had cooking up, as Madelyne also recruited a number of other mutant women to form her own Sisterhood, securing their loyalty by promising each one that she would resurrect one person of their choosing. Members of this group included Martinique and Reagan Wingard, half-sisters who inherited illusion-casting abilities from their father, Mastermind. Chimera, an extra-dimensional criminal who could form twin dragon heads out of telekinetic energy extending from her body. Spiral, a six-armed sorceress from the Mojoverse, whose time-looping origin story was explained in my video on Longshot. And Yuriko Oyama, aka Lady Deathstrike, a cyborg with retractable foot-long adamantium claws for fingers. While capable of manifesting and interacting with the material plane, Madelyne was not a fully physical being and sought to inhabit a suitable body, that of Jean Grey. Now, reanimating a corpse and implanting it with a powerful psychic consciousness was a risky proposition, but Madelyne found the perfect subject to test it out on first, the corpse of Betsy Braddock. You see, years prior to this, Spiral had transferred Betsy's mind into the body of a Japanese mutant named Quanon, and vice versa. Quanon ultimately fell victim to the mutant-killing legacy virus and died in Betsy's body. Betsy, meanwhile, lived in Quanon's body and continued operating as the X-Man Psylocke. And all that is to say that with her original body dead and her mind still alive in another, Betsy Braddock made the perfect test subject for the resurrection magic that Madelyne had devised. Abducting Psylocke and exhuming her corpse, Madelyne repaired Betsy's original body and transferred her life force back into it. However, she also brainwashed the revived Betsy, twisting darker aspects of her personality into an evil spirit of sorts, and recruiting her onto the Sisterhood. With the test run successful, Madelyne and her Sisterhood launched an attack on the X-Men, using her psychic connection with the captive empath to find their new headquarters. Stealing a lock of Jean Grey's hair before escaping, Madelyne was able to use it to find the location of Jean's grave. Suspecting what she was after, the X-Men contacted their ally in New York, Domino, who swapped out Jean's corpse for a similar-looking decoy. Followed by a team of X-Men, Madelyne arrived and attempted to revive and inhabit what she thought was the body of Jean Grey. But because of the hero's deception, the spell failed and Madelyne's psionic form dissipated once again. While that was happening, another group of X-Men launched an attack on the Sisterhood's base to rescue Psylocke. In the ensuing battle, Betsy's persona was able to begin reasserting herself and defeat the dark aspect controlling her. While the X-Man Dazzler inadvertently damaged Betsy's original body beyond repair, Psylocke was able to survive by returning to Quanon's body once again. And with their leader gone, the rest of the Sisterhood escaped and disbanded. Now, I will note that sometime after that, Deathstrike allied herself with a group of self-aware machines called the Descendants. That group clashed with a team of secret Avengers and Psylocke's twin brother, Captain Britain. In the end, the Descendants were destroyed and Lady Deathstrike along with them. However, she left behind a backup copy of her mind entrusted to her ally, the Yakuza assassin, Reiko. That'll be relevant in a second, but for the next part of our story, we must introduce another character, a wealthy Colombian woman named Anya Cortez. A child of immense privilege, Cortez sought power and thrill, and had herself transformed into a cyborg capable of housing the nanites containing Lady Deathstrike's consciousness, which she obtained from Reiko. This reborn Lady Deathstrike, whose mind was a combination of both Yuriko and Anya, assembled a new sisterhood by recruiting the mutant assassin Typhoid Mary and the Asgardian sorceress Amora the Enchantress. Their goal was to obtain samples of the ancient bacteria, Arkea, and use it to attain global domination. However, Arkea was a highly intelligent, sentient entity and infected Reiko so it could use her as a host body. Seizing control of the Sisterhood, Arkea demanded they recruit Selene Gallio and Madelyne Pryor, much to Deathstrike's dismay. Having been exploded into tiny airborne particles sometime before this, Selene, as a virtually immortal mutant, was actually relatively easy to resurrect simply by having the Enchantress magically reconstitute her body. Madelyne would be trickier as no actual physical trace of her remained, but Arkea was nonetheless able to obtain the psychic remnants of her disembodied consciousness. Anya, meanwhile, had grown to regret what she had done and contacted the X-Men, revealing Arkea's location before attempting to end her own life. That was not enough to stop Arkea from using her, however, and the sentient bacteria pulled Deathstrike's nanites from Anya's body into Reiko's. Through a combination of Arkea's science and Amora's magic, Anya's body was completely transformed into a duplicate of Madelyne's, capable of housing her consciousness, effectively sacrificing Cortez so that Pryor could live again. However, all that effort ended up not paying off when the X-Men arrived to confront the villains. Madelyne initially intended on standing by Arkea out of gratitude for resurrecting her, but when Storm offered to let her and Selene go free if they just stopped fighting, the two women took their opportunity to escape. After that, despite promising to lead another sisterhood, Madelyne Pryor remained relatively quiet for the next several years. A group of young time-displaced X-Men did have several encounters with a Madelyne Pryor, but this Goblin Queen was an other-dimensional counterpart who wound up on the Prime Earth after the multiversal Secret Wars. After that, Professor X and Magneto worked together to establish a paradise for all mutants on the island of Krakoa, a nation which offered amnesty for mutant criminals and could even bring dead mutants back to life. A fresh start for their entire race, with a notable exception. In an effort to avoid having multiple copies of the same person running around, Krakoa's resurrection protocols generally excluded clones. And so, as a clone of Jean Grey, Madelyne Pryor largely went unnoticed and unloved, while even the likes of Apocalypse were given a pardon and allowed to live in paradise. Once again, seeking revenge, she seized control of Mr. Sinister's abandoned cloning lab and plotted to invade Krakoa with a legion of imperfect Marauder clones, the Marauders being Mr. Sinister's original mutant henchmen. Having allied with Krakoa, Sinister dispatched a new team of Hellions to destroy the lab, including Madelyne's former lover, Alex Summers, aka Havoc. Alex confronted Madelyne, but she attempted to seduce him to her side and nearly succeeded. However, she was interrupted by one of Sinister's oldest followers, John Greycrow, who shot her through the heart, killing her almost instantly. Alex hoped that Krakoa's ruling body, the Quiet Council, would approve her resurrection, and although Cyclops spoke on his behalf, the request was denied, at least at first. Eventually, Emma Frost successfully convinced the other council members that Madelyne Pryor had become her own distinct individual and qualified for resurrection. Thus, she was brought back to life once again. Meanwhile, Ilyana Rasputina, aka Magic, the de facto ruler of Limbo, began feeling that she had too many responsibilities to balance. Drawing up a contract that would prevent her from acting against mutant kind again, Ilyana entrusted control of Limbo to Madelyne. And Madelyne agreed, once more taking the title the Goblin Queen. But if you want to see how that turned out, you can check out the Spider-Man X-Men crossover event, Dark Web. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. The issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me also give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members, all of whom help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. And as always, if there is anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!